Good morning. This is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada. Today is Tuesday, November the 12th, 2024, and joining me participating in this important update is Virginia La Torre Jeker, and we have an update on the life and times of Mr. Schwarzbaum, a man who is making FBAR famous and understandable to the average penalty receiver. Well, Virginia, how are you today?
Hey, John, I'm doing great. It's quite late here in Dubai, 8:15 p.m., but I'm going to try and keep myself doing well during your podcast, even though it's a bit late for me.
Well, this will be a short one in any case. So, the last time we talked, it's very, very important because the 11th Circuit had ruled that basically FBAR penalties are subject to the Eighth Amendment excessive fines clause, right?
Yes, that was really great news. And that happened in the case of Mr. Schwarzbaum. It's the first case we know of that has granted that status to FBAR penalties, that they are subject to the excessive fines clause. And even though it didn't help Mr. Schwarzbaum in any significant way, since the other big penalty amounts were upheld, but there were two smaller accounts that the court determined were fined excessively with the FBAR penalties, given the amount in those accounts. So this is great news for mankind.
A small win for Mr. Schwarzbaum, but a big win for mankind, I would say. I mean, I think that was a seismic decision. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, there's a saying in life that no good deed goes unpunished, right?
Yes.
And, I noticed that the U.S. government has tried to appeal this decision, at least in part, right?
Yes. Yes, let's see what's going to happen. Now, what they have done is they're trying to advise the court to please clarify a certain portion of their decision in the Schwarzbaum case. Would you say that's an accurate way to describe that?
I think that's exactly what they're doing, and I think that they're kind of spooked because, I just read their petition to appeal it, but it seems pretty clear that they're concerned that the court essentially has conflated the meaning of willful in civil FBAR penalties to the meaning in criminal FBAR penalties. And although the word willful or willfully is in both statutes, that doesn't mean that they mean the same thing in each of those statutes, right?
That's right. The standard for criminal willfulness is much, much higher than the standard for civil willfulness.
Yeah, so let's pause on that for a second. For those of you who are FBAR aficionados or FBAR historians or FBAR scholars or FBAR sociologists who appreciate the importance of FBAR in American culture, we basically have two separate types of penalties, right? So we can, they can have civil penalties or we can have criminal penalties. And interestingly, under the category of civil penalties, there is a civil willful penalty, as opposed to under criminal penalties, the civil criminal penalty. And the criminal penalty, let's start there because I think that's always been more clear and more well known. What are your thoughts on that, the criminal penalty?
So the willfulness standard for a criminal penalty is that there has to be a violation of what's called a known legal duty.
The intentional violation
of a
known
legal duty. That's right. So if you
with emphasis on the words known legal duty, what would that mean in the context of FBAR?
Well, if you did not know about FBAR, you didn't know it existed, you had, as many of our clients have told us, I never heard of this thing called FBAR. What is it? What am I supposed to have done? So if you didn't know, how could you violate a known legal duty if you had no knowledge of it? It would not be possible. So you could not
In
have.
other words, you have to know very specifically that, there is an FBAR law out there, and that law requires me to fill out this form. I mean, you have to actually know that there was a law requiring you to do this, correct?
That's right.
And that's a very different thing from, intentionally not filling out the form. That's a different thing, isn't it? Right? Because you can intentionally fail to fill out a form without knowing anything about whether there's a legal duty to do it, right?
That's right.
That's the story of my life. I hate filling out forms. Do you like filling out forms?
No, John, that's why I don't do any kind of forms.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. All right. So reading the petition to get this thing heard again, what the government seems to be saying is, whoa, hold on a minute here. What the 11th Circuit seems to have been saying was that you use exactly the same test for willfulness when you're considering a civil FBAR penalty than if it were a criminal FBAR penalty, right? That's how they're reading the court's decision, isn't it?
Yes. The court had some ambiguities in there, and part of the law they did state correctly, but then it got confusing when they went to other portions in their opinion. And that's what the government is trying to clarify. They're like, well, you got this section right, but then you said this, and that's kind of conflating willful and non-willful. And we want to clarify all of this.
So the government is saying, look, we'd like for the court to make it very, very clear that the meaning of willful in the criminal context is not the same as the meaning of willful in the civil context. Was that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what they're worried about, because if you conflate the two, criminal and civil willfulness, then it's going to be much more difficult for the government to win on saying this guy acted willfully in a civil context if I have to prove that it was an intentional violation of a known legal duty. So, yeah, they want that.
That's absolutely right. So, if one were cynical, I don't know anybody who is in this regard, but if one were cynical, would you say that it's possible that the government is concerned with preserving its penalty base?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because that's a much, much higher standard of proof. The intentional violation of a known legal duty than just intentionally not filling out a form, right? Or recklessly not filling out a form.
Yes, absolutely.
But of course, in fairness to the government, though, if they are the same, right? It's interesting. The government makes the point that in the criminal context, the test is the intentional violation of a known legal duty to make the point that they're different. I suppose that to some extent, this also could go the other way, couldn't it? I'm not sure what would that mean to go the other way, but we would not want somebody to be convicted criminally if it were short of the intentional violation of a known legal duty, right? We sure wouldn't want that.
No.
So, I find myself in a situation here where I think the government's actually, if the decision was in fact ambiguous, I think the government actually is performing a public service in getting this clarified. Do you agree with me on that, or
So maybe I'm too cynical, but I don't think the government was. I don't think the government's main purpose was to provide this public service. I think the main thing they were concerned about was going forward, we want it crystal clear that the civil willful standard is not an intentional violation of a known legal duty. Other cases have decided this. They have whittled away over time. You and I have been studying FBAR for I don't know how many years now. And we have seen, we all thought originally the Cheek standard, that's what it's known as, was the intentional violation of a known legal duty. We all thought that that was what willful meant in the civil context for FBAR violations. And we found out through the court cases that have come down that no, that is not what we consider to be willful. You can be willful in violating the FBAR rules if you are in reckless disregard of the rules and regulations, or if you have what's called willful blindness, like you kind of turn your head the other way and don't investigate when you've been given certain clues that you should be investigating further and you don't do it. So, for example, if you see on Schedule B the question, do you have a foreign financial account? And you don't look further about that, to find out what does that mean? Should I be checking yes on this? Should I look at the instructions and understand more? If you don't do any of that, then, the court can look at you and say, well, maybe, you've had some willful blindness going on. So the government wants to make it crystal clear that what they mean in the civil context with willfulness is just that. It doesn't mean you need this intentional disregard of a known legal duty. And that.
I think that's their prime motivator as well. And this, of course, is I would guess, I mean, if I were sitting around listening to government lawyers talking about this, I would guess that, the Bidner decision, right? Where they're saying in a non-willful civil context, the penalty is per form based rather than per account, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've discussed before about how that might incentivize them to go for the willful civil penalty, right?
That's right. Because if they can only get $10,000 a pop for a non-willful violation per form per calendar year, there's not much incentive there. When if that same action could be somehow determined to be willful under a lower standard of proof, then they can get 50% of the value of the account or $100,000, whichever is greater. So if you have a $2 million account, you got $1 million right there.
Yeah, and once we move into the civil willful, we're outside the scope of the $10,000 for the just based on one form, right? I think it moves into the per account. Yeah.
Yes, it's per account for willful violations. Yes.
Well, Virginia, I think that's probably right. I think that the court is concerned that 11th Circuit decision in Schwarzbaum might limit their penalty base going forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is a bad thing. Well, we'll see how it goes. I mean, it's impossible to predict this stuff, but do you think the court is likely to clarify that and just write a one sentence? Yeah, we clarify that there's nothing about it that could in any way reduce the government's penalty base.
I think they will clarify it because I think the court, not only looking at it from the perspective of wants to protect the penalty base, I think the court would be more concerned with, we want to make sure that this decision will be, read in a way that's going to be fair to people coming down the road and citing it as precedent. And we don't want, judges or juries to be confused on this issue. And so there is enough precedent out there saying what willfulness means in the civil context for an FBAR violation. And let's clarify that, because we don't want some poor person to be, hit with a willful violation when it might not be, and it could have been non-willful because of our quote unquote confusion here.
My guess is they're going to clarify it too. Man, it is complicated being an American citizen, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's complicated to be an American tax advisor as well.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, this has been an interesting discussion. And, this Mr. Schwarzbaum, I mean, he has like he has brought an understanding of FBAR to the masses, hasn't he?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, his cases have involved so many different facets for FBAR.
I mean, the
And
guy is simply unbelievable. I think that you and I ought to create the Isaac Schwarzbaum FBAR University.
interestingly enough, when I first blogged about Mr. Schwarzbaum, I got an email from him and he requested that I take down my blog post.
Really?
Yes, yes. I was reporting on one of the first case, I think, that involved him. And I very politely replied and I said, "Dear Mr. Schwarzbaum, your case is a matter of public record. And my blog post is just advising readers about your case." I mean, my blog posts are very factual. I don't get into politics. I don't get into, what I may personally
It's hard to
think.
imagine how any of your blog posts could offend anybody.
Exactly. So, I just said to him, "Sorry, it's staying up there." And I never heard from him again. But I've had a few follow-up blog posts about Mr. Schwarzbaum because his various issues in the FBAR world have educated us. They have educated us. I mean, one of the things that we just spoke about earlier is the fact he has foreign accounts. They are in Switzerland. He was now ordered by the court, to repatriate the foreign funds into the U.S. so that they could be attached by the U.S. government to satisfy the FBAR penalties. And the reason the court can order him to do that is because they have jurisdiction over him because he is a U.S. citizen. They don't have jurisdiction over the foreign assets. Okay, they're in Switzerland. To get attachment of those assets is very, very difficult for the government. So the easier way to do it is to mandate that the U.S. person repatriate them to America so they can be attached. I don't know what's happened with that. If he has done it, I sort of doubt it, given his demeanor and the way he has been, handling his cases. I doubt he
Doesn't
has
seem likely to me
repatriated.
somehow.
But, you never know. It'll be interesting to see whatever happens because, I've read, and I don't know much about this because I've never handled this kind of case, but the FBAR penalty has been assessed. It's millions of dollars. His monies are all in Switzerland. What's to prevent him now from, acting in contempt of court, not repatriating back to the U.S., setting up various asset protection schemes of one sort or another? I don't know. And I think with this kind of FBAR penalty, if it's been reduced to judgment, there's only a certain amount of time that the government has to try and satisfy that. Like after a certain number of years, they're barred. So my guess is he's getting, pretty heavy duty advice as to how he can protect his millions. that are in Switzerland.
Clearly, he's got, he's
He's got
surrounded
an
by
army of
the
attorneys
finest
over there.
lawyers money can buy. I'm sure that I mean, look at how far he's fought this stuff. I mean, this is more than just a
Exactly.
guy who wants to fight this stuff. I mean, this is somebody who's just, armed to the hilt, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, they're probably looking at, I don't know his nationality. I'm guessing he might be Swiss. I read somewhere he's a naturalized citizen. So he has another nationality that I doubt he gave up. So he went to Switzerland. Let's assume for the sake of argument that he is Swiss. I don't think under the Swiss treaty with the U.S. or anything like that they can extradite him, that the Swiss government would extradite him to the States. So, maybe he can really fight this thing with every possible legal weapon available.
Well, he is fighting it. I mean, it's pretty clear that he is.
Right. I know. But let's say, I think he's probably already implementing some steps for asset protection that, they can't get the money. I don't know. It's a fascinating case. I wish we could be a fly on the wall in his legal offices over there in
Well,
Switzerland.
I think that I think he's, in all seriousness, I think that he's performed a very important public service. All his escapades, right, has, what it's done is it's assumed a relatively consistent fact pattern, right? And people have seen so many aspects of FBAR issues through that fact pattern. So, that's really good. But I think the best is yet to come because, contextually, of course, we have the First Circuit in Toth, ruling that somehow FBAR penalties are not excessive, are not fines within the meaning of the Eighth Amendment. And now we have the 11th Circuit saying the opposite. And I think this is really in response to Justice Gorsuch's,
Yes.
the Gorsuch dissent, in the Toth petition to hear the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's likely the Supreme Court may take this case now that we got this direct conflict between the First and the 11th Circuits. What do you think? So Schwarzbaum on to the Supreme Court.
Maybe. Look, it's ridiculous that they say, in my view, that they say this FBAR penalty is not subject to the excessive fines clause.
It's absolutely foolish.
It's almost insulting the way they've argued this. So I hope the Supreme Court does take it and set this record straight.
I hope they do too. This stuff is just, it's like the great Charles Adams, in his book about taxation, civilization, had this phrase where he called these laws synthetic felonies, things that are mostly, divorced from any kind of common sense or morality, that are just written down somewhere. And I think that, this probably qualifies because my understanding of this guy is that, again, this is money he inherited from his father. This was not money that was somehow that had escaped U.S. taxation or, this sort of stuff, right? It's just, is ridiculous too strong of a word? I'm not sure. But I think the majority of humanity would be very surprised that for failing to file a few pieces of paper, that they would take, 50% of this guy's net worth or something, right?
John, I can't remember what else is involved here. In other words, was he earning a lot of money by investments with these foreign accounts and the income was unreported? So that gives rise to other issues. I don't think it was just a matter of he didn't file an FBAR. I think there's more to this entire case.
Well, I think that a book ought to be written about Mr. Schwarzbaum. And of course, it's the guy's fascinating, obviously. Most people would not dig in their heels to the extent that this guy has.
No, he's a rebel. I like it. Let's see where it takes us because we are learning so much.
Yeah, well, okay. You're writing about Mr. FBAR and generally and Mr. Schwarzbaum particularly on your blog. So what are your blog coordinates as we bring this to a close today?
Okay, so people can find all of the blog posts, and we do have a whole category on FBAR. You can find it at www.us-tax.org. O-R-G. All
right. Well, that's great. Thanks for connecting with me today. And, as long as FBAR penalties continue, Virginia, you're going to have plenty of fodder for podcasts, I guess, right?
I think so, John. Yes, I think so. Thanks so much for having this great discussion with me today.
Thank you.